Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and Dino Fury has at long last premiered. I won't belabor the point with too much build-up, since initial thoughts don't lend themselves to that style of writing anyway, so I'll just open by saying, Destination Dino Henge rocked! And yes, pun intended, because I always intend my puns. Most of you should know that by now. So let's take a closer look at this episode and discuss all the specific things that rock about it. If you were thinking about how Emilia's go-getter attitude and semi-confrontational relationship with her boss reminded you of Dino Charge, you're not alone. But you'll also all recall that this focus on humbler, put-upon beginnings with ambitious goals ended up being the foundation for Zoe as well. And that tracks, since we've had a fairly similar writing team since Judd Lin took over as showrunner starting with Dino Charge. Which is why so much about the structure and plot of this first episode had a Ninja Steel premiere type of setup as well. So even though Simon Bennett leads the charge in the now, those familiar writing flares are still ever present. And with all this time apart from Super Megaforce, notably helmed by Jonathan Sakor with James Bates responsible for most of the better writing touches, we can see a lot more about how the people creating the show right now think about it, and how they like to structure things. But even looking beyond the behind-the-scenes thought processes, what we got from our cast here feels really promising. Emilia's relationship to a job she's doing for the promise of a bigger prize will likely keep her interesting throughout. But more interesting still, to me, is how they will end up ultimately framing her current line of work. Buzz Blast being the, big air quotes here, journalism that it is, could easily come off as the job she needs, but not the job she wants. But Emilia seems confident that she can affect change from within simply by pushing the envelope enough. Plus, her particular obsessions might have actually led her to Buzz Blast in the first place, a responsibility that she's clearly passionate enough about to understand inside and out and work hard at. So where that working relationship goes will likely end up telling us the most about Emilia as a character. Interestingly enough, this essentially makes her a light adaptation of Ui, my favorite character from Ryu Soldier, as opposed to Asuna, who is her literal Pink Ranger counterpart. Since both were characterized as the creators of kooky, acquired taste types of videos, and happening upon this ancient society of Dino Warriors. But since they'll never in 65 million years also adapt any of the major issues I had with how Ui's character was handled, I think at bare minimum she'll be pretty fine. Moving the conversation to Ollie, even for as pragmatic as he presents himself as being, he's already proven to have a keen sense for banter, so I can see his likely numerous disagreements with his current and future teammates being equally as entertaining as they were here, even when he's not getting electrocuted for his troubles. But he also shows flashes of that Theo Martin type of dorky excitability when he talks about how, as Rangers, they'll definitely get Zords soon. Tiny details like that always go a long way with building characters, so even with the lion's share of focus placed on Emilia's present and Zato's past, I don't think Ollie was shortchanged here. Speaking of Zato, I really liked his overall presence as this semi-stoic, young-looking yet seasoned warrior. At first glance, this general Red Ranger archetype, which was utilized a lot in the previous era, would somewhat understandably make fans wary. I think it's an overhated characteristic, even if the reasons I find it interesting are largely incidental. But even for as much as I find Troy's fight against emotional openness and Brody's stilted idea of being human after spending a lot of time not on Earth somewhat compelling, I certainly don't blame anyone for not gravitating towards them, especially when you have a gem like Tyler just sitting there in the middle of the two ready to be loved. But I suspect a lot of fans, myself included, will end up taking to Zato much more. And for me, it really starts and ends with one scene. Maybe my favorite in the episode. Zato had been in stasis for 65 million years, but didn't know the full details until he was forced awake. And then, cool as a cucumber, he assesses the situation and aids in the fight. Pretty solid introduction, but what really sold me on him as far as a first impression goes is what happens after. When he finally does realize that he's been in stasis for all that time, all he can think to do is take a step back and consider the sheer magnitude of what that all means. There is only so much we know about him so far, and this show could really go in any number of directions from here, so I won't speculate too much on the specifics. But it just really grabs me that he is first presented as this badass level-headed warrior who, even right after stasis, can jump into a conflict and help resolve it. But then, he has to stand there and really consider how in this situation, in this time, there's a lot of answers he won't have, and that kind of scares him. For all we know, they might never play around with that implication ever again, but at least in this moment, I really liked how his reaction here could mean so many things. We should also probably talk about how novel and fascinating the antagonist setup is already proving to be. Void Knight is the main attraction here so far, but who's to say what that will mean when Boom Tower or any of the other Ryu soldier generals they could adapt at some point show up. But the Thesporix in particular interests me most, mainly because, unlike almost all Monsters of the Week setups, they are an infection, a somewhat hive-minded set of planet destroyers that don't really follow a typical villain hierarchy. Void Knight being able to recruit one who happened to hatch lends itself to far too many possibilities to discuss properly, especially since Zato recognizes that this armor should belong to someone else. But I'm most curious as to how they'll handle these guys, since it was so easy for the first one we see to simply fall in line with Void Knight's plans. Based on Zato's story, they would strike you as not quite sentient, and in turn, act less like Monsters of the Week and more like the foot soldiers of, well, every day. But if that's not the case, then what's to stop Emilia, who is notably fascinated by the paranormal, to reach out to one in the same way Void Knight did? Which is to say, what's to stop them from being this generation's mutants, beings also initially characterized as single-minded and heartless, only for the more advanced members of that species to not embody either trait? There's a better than likely chance that this idea never actually happens, but I still can't help but think about how ecstatic I would be if it did. But also, I never anticipated that they would do as deep a lore cut as the Morphin Masters. It's been slightly spread around that these were Boom Comics exclusive characters up to this point, so allow me to dispel that confusion right off the bat. The Morphin Masters actually originated in an early episode of MMPR called Big Sisters, where said masters created a set of power eggs millions of years ago that Rita wanted to get her hands on. She, of course, fails and everyone moves on to next week's episode. But Destination Dino Henge presents what by all means seems to be an intentional expansion on that random one-and-done premise from 1993. What we see here is how the Thesporix are also treated as something akin to powerful eggs, with one literally hatching this episode. So their reinterpretation of the Morphin Masters here creates an entire premise where that power was also contained due to their involvement, also millions of years ago, but this time, the lead antagonist succeeds in unleashing it upon modern-day Earth. Not at all the type of MMPR reference I could have anticipated from really any season, but a very creative detail nonetheless. All in all, Dino Fury's opening episode showed a lot of promise, but in ways that do feel distinct from how other recent seasons have opened. It's a lot in the minor details so far, since a lot of this episode is remarkably similar to things we've seen before, but you can sort of feel the loosening of the Saban-era restrictions placed on previous seasons. New showrunner Simon Bennett discussed that very thing in great detail during his many Dino Fury interviews. If nothing else, we should all be giving this man full marks for being so open and honest about his process, putting so much work into multiple interviews, and generally trying to get the word out as much as possible about the show he now proudly oversees. So while I've only seen 22 full minutes of him and his team's totality of work so far, I have nothing but respect for the way he's working, his mindset on what this show and this franchise can be to all that watch it, and how the actors working under him have really seemed to embrace that attitude as well. In these first 22 minutes, early a take as it may be, admittedly, I felt a lot of that shine through. There is a lot of novelty with some of the camera work and the way the current score blends into the various scenes. There's a lot of creativity in how they've reinterpreted certain aspects of PR's past and incorporated them here. And so far, there's a lot of fun with how the characters bounce off each other and how they come off as individuals as well. So while Dino Fury is similar to a lot of seasons in a lot of obvious ways, I most look forward to seeing how it will stand on its own, and what type of message it imparts when it finally does. And for that, we'll just have to keep on watching. So those were my initial thoughts on the opening episode. Let me know yours down below, as well as whatever crazy fan theories you might have as to why Zato and Solon used to carry around living samples of their enemies. And as always, thanks for watching.